Hi everyone, my name is Rhys Leahy. I'm a security researcher on CrowdStrike's intelligence team. Oh, thank you. I'm here today with my colleagues, Megan Miller and Olivia Kantor. We also want to give a huge shout out and thank you to our colleague who did a ton of work and helped out with this presentation. They know who they are. So we all spend a lot of time on the deep and dark web looking for hacked and leaked data. And today we're here to talk about the dynamics and sort of the economics on some of the main deep and dark web forums and platforms for that data. So these are mugshots of 3 of the most notorious cybercriminals in the deep and dark web. We're going to start off giving a little bit of background and motivation, explaining why we care about these datasets, and more importantly, why cybercriminals care about these datasets. We're also going to give a history of the ecosystem, kind of explain how Breached became the main platform for sharing data leaks. Mainly, it absorbed users and datasets from some of its predecessors, so it wasn't formed in a vacuum. It kind of formed over time, and there's a very interesting story there. Then, once we establish that, we're going to dive into sort of the economics of user activity and datasets and the price of actual leaks on Breached. And then finally, we're going to share some insights on how factors like country, sector, reputation of the user all impact the price and the value that these actors assign to data leaks. And we're going to conclude with how that type of analysis can be applied to other platforms in the deep and dark web. And we're also going to share some thoughts on where this market is going next now that Breached is offline. So background, why do criminals care about these leaks? So a lot of these data leaks contain credentials, so email and password combinations. They might also contain phone numbers, addresses, social security numbers, other types of PII, PHI. And the reason that they care about this is all of this data can be used in phishing campaigns or identity-based attacks, credential-based attacks, where they use these logins to gain access, unauthorized access to a system, and then wage a more aggressive campaign from there. They can also use it in more long-reaching information operations. In fact, some of our colleagues at CrowdStrike found that last year 80% of all cyber attacks started with these identity-based techniques. So these data sets can be really, really invaluable, but we wanted to understand just how invaluable. We wanted to put a price on it and understand how actors assess the value and assign the value when they're trying to buy and sell some of this data. So in order to do that, we needed to understand the market, like the space where this is actually taking place, as well as the users. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. And in order to understand the market, we need to understand how Breached came online and came about. So here's kind of a timeline of key events. Starting in 2015, when an actor named Omni founded a forum called RaidForums. Everyone in this room probably knows exactly what that is. Over the next 8 years, it became a huge hub for data leaks. People would post them there to gain credibility and reputation on the deep and dark web. It also became a space that became very infamous for coordinated harassment and something called swatting. So RaidForums grew in popularity for the next 8 years. And then one day in February of last year, users who had been very active on RaidForums tried to log onto their account only to find that the site was not working as they expected. This raised some suspicion, and users started to suspect that maybe Omni was cooperating with law enforcement or on vacation. So in the vacuum that followed that period of time, a few different users started a few different sites or group chats trying to court RaidForums users to become kind of the new king of their new platform. One very famous attempt was like right as this was going on, a user who had been semi-active on RaidForums called NSA Afterthought started a platform, really creative name, RaidForums 2. They tried to get users over there. But then a month later in March, a very high-profile user on RaidForums named Palm started a new forum called Breached. So they announced the launch of that. And then a month after that, in April of last year, law enforcement announced that they had in fact seized RaidForums. So there's kind of this ongoing competition between RaidForums 2, Breached, some other early startup forums trying to court users. But in the months that followed, users really converged around Breached for a couple of key reasons. And in fact, by June of that year, RaidForums 2, which was kind of the primary competitor early on, their domain redirected to Breached ultimately. So that was really when the market for data leaks kind of consolidated into this one space. By July, Breached had in fact surpassed RaidForums in terms of the volume of data that they were hosting, offering 11 billion records on the official subforum, which is the data leaks that are curated by the admin themselves. And as everyone in this room probably knows, by March of this year, so quite recently, Breached is now taken off of line when law enforcement arrested Palm, the admin, and seized the site. So we wanted to understand the mechanics of how exactly Breached beat out all this competition and overtook RaidForums as the premier space for data leaks on the internet. And we found that a key factor here were the users, the influence of the users and the followers who came. There's a quote, a pretty funny quote that became a rumor on a lot of these forums from an actor named Jaw saying, Omni's off recovering after fighting a mountain lion. So this is like often code for like someone's gone missing or someone might be cooperating with law enforcement. But so as we're looking at those key users, we struggled to identify initially, like how do you find these key users, these key influencers on the platform? The first thing we did as a starting point was we looked at sort of top count of posts, just who's posting the most. And that proved to not be a very effective metric for a couple of reasons. First off, it's the internet. There are bots. People will post a lot, but they're not necessarily real people. Also, these forums are structured in a way where you have to comment to unlock certain content. So just posting the most frequently doesn't mean that you're contributing to the site the most. It could just be people trying to gain access to some of these data sets. So instead, we started looking at alternative ways to measure, who are the most influential users on that site. And some of the key things we found were looking into who starts the most threads and how often, and then how popular are those threads on the forum. So how many different users are engaging with it, responding to it, starting a conversation around it, not just like posting into the void and spamming people, but actually like kicking off a conversation, sharing valuable data. So in order to do that, we developed a power ranking for these different users, basically looking at how long users have been there, like a combination of longevity, and then how often they're posting and how much engagement there is. So looking at that activity. The idea here is you've been here a long time and you're posting a lot and people are listening. So we found that this was a much more effective way at evaluating who really has influence on Breached. And when we break down this power ranking and some of the different factors that go into it of the two key users we were discussing initially, Palm, who founded Breached, and NSA Afterthought, who founded RaidForums 2, we can see that their activity really diverges, and that likely contributed to which platform ended up being a lot more successful. So on the left here, you've got NSA Afterthought's activity on RaidForums, the 6 months leading up to RaidForums being seized, and then same for Palm. Each dot is a thread that they started, and the color and the size of the dots correspond to the number of unique users engaging with the thread that they started, or the post that they kicked off. So we can see that NSA Afterthought did not start a lot of activity, didn't have a very high reputation on Breached or on RaidForums or a lot of influence, whereas Palm had posted a lot of very high-profile data leaks, including the Park Mobile leak. He had posted frequently, he got a lot of user engagement, and this all contributed to his ability to build trust and influence on this platform. So when he started Breached, people listened and followed and trusted him. So here, if you look at, these are our broader power ranking results, you can see that Palm was actually 5th in our power ranking of users overall on RaidForums. If you look at the x-axis, you'll see some other names that you might recognize if you were active on Breached, because a lot of them ended up following and moving over there as well. That screenshot is some of Palm's posts on RaidForums back when that was still around. And now that we've got all of the users over there, we want to understand some of the content that's keeping them there. So we started looking a little bit more into leaks and how the site sort of transformed from RaidForums to Breached. So when users migrated to Breached, they probably noticed that it was very similar. It was built with the exact same MyBB framework that RaidForums had, but Palm made some very key editorial decisions when designing the site. So if we look at the panel on the left here, those are subforums that were on RaidForums, but were not carried over to Breached. And if we look at the panel on the left, those are subforums that were added to Breached, but had never existed on RaidForums. We notice some very key trends here. First off, the panel on the left includes quite a few subforums that were either unrelated to data leaks, we've got subforums on music and gaming, or they contained somewhat illicit content that might attract additional scrutiny from law enforcement that Palm might have been trying to avoid early on. So specifically, the subforum on raiding was left off, as well as some other like NSFW, drug subforums, stuff like that. On the left, we've got the subforums that were added to Breached. The ones highlighted in blue are ones focused on data leaks. So we see that Palm deliberately added 6 additional subforums focused around data, such as Stealer logs, combo lists, a database discussion subforum, and those proved to be some of the most popular subforums on the site. So again, speaking to the popularity, this is comparing those subforums on RaidForums and on Breached in the 6 months before and after one was taken offline and one came online. Again, the rows in blue are highlighting ones that are focused on data leaks. And even if we just compare the count of what are the most popular subforums in that period of time, we see that RaidForums only has 4 of the top 10 focused on data leaks, whereas Breach had 7 of the top 10 focused on data leaks. There were also more users, more posts, and more data on the site at this time. So we see leaks are a really key driver of growth, but we wanted to understand, was this everyone? Was this the whole community? Or were there just a few very, very active users posting in these subforums over and over again? And what we found was that there was a very high average number of unique users in each of the data leak subforums. So this is really what people were coming to the platform for, more than anything else. And that is a big differentiator between Breached and what RaidForums was. All in all, we found that in the first 6 months it was online, Breached actually became a much more potent replacement for data leaks than RaidForums ever was. So I'm going to dive into a few case studies really quick before passing it over to my colleagues to talk more about some of these characteristics of the data leaks. But we found, the overwhelming majority of posts on Breached were in English, largely because the admin enforced that. However, if you start looking at posts in other languages, you start seeing some really interesting trends. So these graphs show spikes in activity in 4 non-English languages, specifically Spanish, Indonesian Bahasa, Vietnamese, and Chinese. And like we said, the focus here is like the price and the economics of these data leaks. And we wanted to share, if you look at the panel on the left, that shows Chinese language posts, and that spike is when the Shanghai police database leak came online for sale on Breached. This ended up being one of the most highly listed, expensive data leaks. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And the panel on the right is posts in Indonesian Bahasa. And a lot of this has started around the actor Bjorka, who was very famous around last summer, posting a lot of different leaks targeting the Indonesian government. So we see that spike in activity and drop-off. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues to talk a little bit more about these country and sector dynamics and how that impacts price.
Okay, so we're at the point in the story where Breached has reached its zenith as this really interesting, high-quality marketplace for data online. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. Since March, Breached has been offline, but because of the rich data that was available on the site, we can learn a lot about the trends for leaked data in general that will probably hold wherever the marketplace ends up in the future. Okay, so one of the questions we see a lot when organizations or businesses find their data on a leak website, what now? What's going to happen next? Who's going to buy it? How much is it going to go for? What kind of actors are going to be purchasing this information? So there's a lot of different ways to try and get at and answer that question. But what we decided to do was go sort of the classic Econ 101 route and look at it from the lens of supply and demand. So in terms of supply, we created a price model that simulated just like the cost of any new post that was on the forum and in the for sale sections. The second thing we did was we developed a demand model that was using the length of the thread or the number of replies in the thread to determine, this is going to be our proxy for the demand side. The thing about the internet is that it is, of course, shockingly very messy. So up front, we wanted to talk about some of the issues we ran into there and some of the caveats and assumptions in our data. So to start off with, price was very difficult to extract accurately. It's difficult even though Breached is a pretty well-organized website and there was like a lot of like clear listings much of the time, but sometimes there weren't, so we did our best. The other thing to think about is that replies are a good proxy for demand, but they are not a perfect proxy for demand. A lot of the times, if a post or a leak was especially controversial, or in some cases, if somebody thought it was fraudulent, it would, that's going to garner a lot of attention from the community. That's going to garner a lot of replies, but potentially no one in that thread actually wants to buy the data. So that's another important caveat, and we tried to, use a couple other data points to control for that. The last thing is it's just very difficult to figure out whether these posts are sold. There's a big section of the forum where Palm himself would sort of say, okay, this is sold. Many sellers would often post back to the initial part of the thread, this is actually sold. But beyond that, it's really difficult to tell. Sometimes a buyer and seller will hop off of Breached, go start a private DM. Maybe they negotiate further there. We don't see that. We don't know. So we did our best and we really stuck with the sold posts where we could see it happening on the website itself. So after we cleaned up the data, we looked at what we had, and this was really the fun part. Because it was such a well-organized website, we were able to extract over 18 different features, sort of metadata or information off of the post to use in our analysis. Some stuff like country of origin or sector can be particularly useful when looking at price. Other things like, does this post contain password? That's obviously going to have an impact on how much it sells for. So with that, we were like starting to put together our model, and we said we also just want to look at like what are the economic statistics, the lay of the land to start out with. The first thing we looked at was average prices for countries and sectors. This is important to note about this slide. This is the list price. This is across all of Breached, whether or not the post was sold. It's essentially the seller saying, this is what I think my data is worth. If you are a Succession fan, you might have watched an episode a few weeks ago where you kind of see, prices. They're funny things. You can double them sometimes. You can price them to the moon. And just because Kendall Roy says that Living Plus is worth a certain amount of money, it doesn't mean the market actually will meet that demand. So that being said, the number one sort of most highly priced by sector was aerospace, which I think might be a surprise to a lot of folks who more closely follow these communities. And you actually can see government and financial are way further down on that track. The other top ones are health and entertainment. And so it's not necessarily intuitively what an expert might think. The other side of countries was also interesting to look at. Germany led the pack, and the United States was actually not in the top 10 of that average price list again. When you delve more deeply into the German data, you just see that, kind of like through happenstance, there were a lot of high quality, expensively priced data sets, some relating to gambling and casinos, others to financial data. So sort of just luck of the draw, lay of the land on this front. This was a good starting place for us, and we said, okay, obviously we need to delve more deeply into this data. So the first thing we did was we went back and we said, okay, let's only look at the posts that we actually think sold. So somebody met that demanded price. When you do that, of the leaks that were sold, data from the US, China, and Russia appear most frequently. I think this is pretty intuitive to many of us in this room. Because of the bias on Breached itself to use English, obviously there's going to be a lot of American speakers, a lot of Westerners who want to target the United States. On the flip side, it's kind of fun and exotic maybe if you're based in the state to find a Chinese or Russian data set that is going to draw some interest for you there. The other thing is we broke it down by sector. And again, in the sold section, we're beginning to see trends that you and I might have made initial hypotheses or assumptions about. So the vast majority of the sold posts are going to be related to the government or financial sector. But the interesting thing that you can see is that that second tier of sectors is gaming, entertainment, sports, technology, and those were seen more frequently sold than things like healthcare or critical infrastructure. I think it kind of speaks to this notion that when you're shopping around for your next data leak, you want to buy something that maybe you use, so your favorite streaming website, your favorite gaming website. And so maybe that bias is actually more prevalent than we might assume. The other thing we wanted to look at, because we had seen just how important reputation was in the migration from Raid to Breached, was who are the top sellers? And kind of no surprise, Palm ends up being at the top of that list. That's mostly because, their trust and their authenticity in terms of looking at these leaks were very well valued by the community. So you are probably more likely to shell out for a post that has been sort of assessed by Palm or posted by him rather than some no-name guy. The other thing is that selling is sort of a spin wheel effect. If you are known to be someone who sells high quality data that hasn't been sold elsewhere, people are going to come back to you. They're going to spend more. And so you can kind of have this exponential growth in selling on a platform. The other thing we had always wondered about is some of this data sits on these leaks websites for a very long time. And what impact does that age of the post have on price? And we ran a regression and we determined that indeed it does have a slight negative impact on the final sales price. This could be for two reasons. First is sort of a correlation bias is, if a post is not that interesting, if the leak is not that good, it's just going to sit there for a long time. No one's going to buy it. And the second thing is obviously the quality diminishes over time, or it can. So if you are interested in buying a post where there are passwords, just the odds that that password will be reset over time obviously increases. And the chance that somebody else gets access to that data or it's sold somewhere else and it's not exclusive anymore increases over time. This sort of wraps up our discussion about these underlying economic conditions on the site. And I'm going to turn it over now to start covering the complexities of supply and demand. Which one?
So yeah, we said we were going to talk about supply and demand, but demand was kind of messy, and we were looking for a better proxy. So zooming way in, one place to start examining that true demand was the buyer's subforum itself. I mean, this is a place that's set up where you can literally say, like, hey, does anybody have a database from this country or with this type of information or these accounts? So we see here the US, China, and Germany at the top of specifically mentioned requests in this section. And then in sector, we see tech, finance, gov, and telco being the most mentioned, like, outright. So yeah, it's a kind of a small sample set compared to the full scope of breached. So we do want to like look at it from multiple views, and we zoom back out. And we finally get to the part where we're matching those things together to figure out what a true value might be for something. So utilizing some of these features and all the metadata we previously extracted, we built a simulated model of like that price volume relationship. And as Olivia mentioned, we looked at all the database inventory in the for sale sections and the prices that we could extract from that to inform that supply model, the blue line. And we examined only the post data that we've categorized as sold to simulate the demand and to calculate that equilibrium point for price for databases across breached. So this is a simulated model. It's like to better understand how supply and demand for a certain data set compare to like some of these other correlated factors we've already been looking at, like country and sector. And we use a price range here from $0 to $10,000. So what the visualization kind of means is that if you wanted to perfectly price something on breached, asking for $7,500 is the best price that you might be able to list it for, but still to ensure that you'd sell it. But, you know, we want to know more. So we broke out the script across sector. And shown here, government and financial sector data has a much higher like predicted price equilibrium value than like the entertainment sector or things in this like top left section. And we also did a similar breakout here, but for categorization by the country mentioned. You know, down here in this right cluster, we have like the US, Russia, Great Britain, France, you know, and we do love succession. And, you know, as like Connor Roy would say, if they don't have nukes, I don't know if I want to go. So here it's not super surprising to see that they might have the higher predicted price equilibrium over there. We also busted it out by language. As we said earlier, it's not surprising to see that the language that's requested by the admin and is used to like stamp and verify the quality of a data leak is going to be the one that has the highest predicted price equilibrium point there, compared to those very few leaks posts that were like observed in Russian and were probably asked to just respin it up in English and repost it again anyway. We also did it by word count because we were just like, hey, we did 18 of these, let's take a look. And then we see this crazy high word count on the side and we're like, did we break something? But digging into it, this is just another time when it's like really important to understand the community and the structure of the site you're working in. Because as we look deeper, we just realized there's an entire section that's super low priced or free relating to like log sales. And that's basically the word count is like a structured format they would repeatedly use. It's always nice to know things aren't broken, but this doesn't really tell us much information. So, the thing about supply and demand laws, though, is that they're supposed to assume that all actors in the market are rational. And sometimes things on breach, though, weren't rational. Some actors were truly listing things for irrational prices. We definitely accounted for these outliers in the analysis we did in the prior slides, but we wanted to take a peek anyway. So, for example, we see a lot of times these initial posts that people ask for very quickly down thread, like people are dropping, negotiating, and it ends up to be like much reduced, if it even sells at all. We also need to recognize, again, like Olivia said, it's difficult to ascertain that true sale price or even how many times it's sold based on only some public posts. Also, we need to recognize that some things are just false claimed. To quote like a very non-gullible breached user on this Equifax thread, they said like, for what it's worth, the DOJ indicted 4 members of the Chinese military for this breach. Hey, but maybe they were wrong and it was really you. Well, they weren't. The actor provided samples of the data, we checked it out, and it was a false claim. So to finish up, where does that leave us, right? Breached is gone. That was cool, but where did they go? Yeah, one user wants to use ChatGPT to bail out Palm somehow. Yeah, the shout box was wild the weekend after he got indicted. So basically though, but by combining all of this knowledge of like the breach community and the site structure, along with extracting all those data points and like zooming out from a bird's eye view, like only in combination of looking at all of those things do we gain better insights. And some of those insights included like finding some detailed price values and correlations between price and country and sector of the leaks posted, and an interesting creds. We also have a repeatable framework that we can use to analyze new communities and criminal economies, especially at how they relate to data leaks. An understanding of these and how the participants behave allow us to better like focus our efforts to persistently track them and combat them. But like, what's next? So we're definitely interested in where next to apply that framework. Referencing back to some of the initial things that Rhys talked about with our power user rankings, it's super interesting to note that none of the breach power users continued on to make a new breach successor under their same moniker that they used before, like kind of dropping that influence, at least publicly, that they may have had. This could be because, you know, it didn't work out too well for Palm, as shown in the little snippet like of their indictment here. Like data from Raid itself like played a role in Palm being ID'd. And there were upwards of like 10, 20 forums we saw popping up, launching, stating their desire to be the next breached. But a lot of those have even shut down, have super minimal activity in comparison to their predecessors. We got some screenshots up of like one of the closest options we've seen that has like a hard leaks focus. It's LBSB, but the activity is yet to consistently be in the range of breached. Like as you see here with like the thread count, post count, registered members and things like that. We've also seen like a higher volume of like Telegram leaks and channels related to Telegram leaks. Again, like that might be in response to like not wanting to host a forum-like site in the same way as their predecessors. Yeah, and I'll close there as we look ahead to where to put these frameworks to use next.
Hi, I'm Mike Sexton. I work at a think tank called Third Way. I was curious, when you showed the map of the countries where the most data records are being stolen, it definitely did not look like it was just the most populous countries, with, you know, the top ones being the United States, China, Russia, and of course I think we're all well aware of the kind of status of the Russian cybercriminal underground and the way the Russian government turns a blind eye to it, which could accommodate for like the high presence of US records there. But I'm curious, to what degree do you see geopolitics as being a driving factor in the way that these statistics play out, or is it not?
So that's a really good question. I think one way to look at it is this was like a pretty US English-speaking focus on the forums. So certainly, I guess someone you don't want to defecate where you sleep or whatever, but that doesn't actually seem to be true sometimes, especially with the US data. I do kind of think the geopolitical element is there, especially with the popularity of China and Russia datasets, just because you don't have to be like a patriot and pro-US to want to go after those actors, but you're like, oh, it's kind of like sexy and exotic and bad, and like I'd love to have crime focused on those people instead. So I do think it's an element, but I also think the quality of the data and like that sector is like maybe even more powerful sometimes, all in combination. Do you guys have anything to add?
I was just gonna say, like, most of the time we just grab the data and we leave that question to someone else.
Fair enough. I'd always prefer to be conservative and let other people draw their inferences and let them be wrong instead. Thank you.
Yeah.